Chapter 35 The Prince and the Bride. Ariel. The wedding reception was held in the throne room of the Red Keep, with a seating arrangement not unlike what Ariel had seen at Hogwarts. There was a raised dais for the head table set before the Iron Throne for House Targaryen, with Aegon and Bella in the middle. There was a wide aisle from the entrance doors leading up to the dais, with rows of long tables on each side for the guests. Ariel and Hagrid were placed at the far left table towards the front, close to the raised dais. The Baratheons sat opposite them, and the Celticars were down the table by Hagrid's other side. Everything was meticulously executed, from the decorations to the food. There were extravagant dishes prepared, though even within the Red Keep Ariel saw the telltale signs of winter restrictions across the spreads. Instead of plates brimming with colorful meals of ripe fruits, bright berries or animals easier to hunt in summer, this meal lent more towards winter vegetables of mashed turnips and cabbage, fresh bread, boiled potatoes, cheese, nuts, venison stew, steaming poultry and long roasted ox. It was mouth-watering, though Ariel would have been more comfortable seated with the Valarians instead of the Baratheons, whom she didn't know well. When they sat down, Lord Boros had looked Ariel up and down, and judged her surprisingly pretty for a foreigner. Though they had met several times before, this was the first time the Stormlander Lord addressed her, and he behaved as if it was the highest of flatteries to be acknowledged by him. Ariel had to bite her tongue so not to answer that Lord Boros' opinion was pretty unsurprising coming from a willingly illiterate man. After that, Lord Boros spent the dinner with riveted attention on Hagrid alone, asking Hagrid about his experience with the dragons at Dragonstone, and boisterously interested in what sort of hunts he'd done back in England and Essos, and how the animals differed from the game in Westeros. While the men talked, Ariel was left conversing with Lady Alenda Baratheon and her daughter Eileen. The Baratheons had been at the Red Keep for months, but only half remained for the wedding. After Eileen's betrothal, her three sisters returned to the Stormlands, likely because of the scene Cassandra was involved in on the Grand Staircase. It was such a beautiful ceremony, don't you agree, Lady Ariel? My mother and I talked of it in the carriage. Prince Aegon couldn't take his eyes off his wife. Lady Bella looked so beautiful. Ariel wasn't sure how old the girl was, but guessed 9. Maybe 10 if she was a little short for her age. Regardless of the precise number, Lady Eileen's speech tempo had the speed of a rap song, but without the rhyming. Eileen's words blurred together and made it hard for someone who spoke Common Tongue as a third language to catch everything, especially with Lady Eileen's choppy Stormlander accent. It was her words Ariel struggled with though. Put on the spot about how nice the wedding was, there was so much she longed to answer, but none of it socially acceptable. From the simply rude no, to a more scathing whose wedding did you attend? To I thought it was considered taboo when the bride wasn't a maiden, and Bella had to be old enough to have flowered to be counted as a maiden. Ariel had calmed down from her argument with Aemond, but she was still grumpy, and whenever she tried to formulate something appropriate, her mind kept conjuring nothing but snarky remarks. Fortunately, the Baratheon ladies didn't seem to have noticed. The dragons flying into King's Landing, the feasts and the music is so elegant here. I can't wait for the dances to start, I hope it's soon. Lady Eileen gushed. It's so wonderful. I'm sure they will sing of this wedding for years to come, just as they did King Jaehaerys and Queen Elassane. Unlikely. Ariel glanced sharply at Lady Eileen. It was remarks akin to that, making her just a little paranoid. Why would a daughter of House Baratheon compare a prince's wedding to a lady with that between a king and queen? How so? Eileen asked, nonplussed. For one, Jaehaerys and Elassane married twice. The first time in secret because there was opposition by the Faith and Council. Ariel rattled off the top of her head. Jaehaerys was king but in his minority, and he married his little sister in secret to prevent... Ariel trailed off, anticipating a reaction at this point, but neither mother or daughter seemed to know what she spoke about. The small council and Dowager Queen intended another husband for Elassane, so King Jaehaerys snuck off to Dragonstone with his sister and they married in secrecy. Their marriage was nothing like this. If anyone's, it's similar to the marriage between Princess Rhaenyra and Prince Daemon not long ago. But I was told there was a great feast. If so, that was likely during their second marriage a year later, after King Jaehaerys came of age and set the Iron Throne. Ariel said. Why would they marry each other twice? Several reasons, I expect, both political and practical, such as how the first wedding went unconsummated. Why'd that be? Ariel sighed at Elaine's relentless request for clarification. For the same reason this one won't be. The bride was too young. You know a lot of history, Lady Ariel, said Lady Elaine, impressed. Ariel found it more curious how they didn't know, since that was Baratheon history. The way Ariel had heard the tales, the head of House Baratheon had a prominent role as the evil stepfather in the whole mess. Then again, Lady Elenda was from House Karen and married into the Baratheons, whilst Elaine was only a little girl. Maybe Elaine wasn't a short 10-year-old after all. Maybe she was a tall 8-year-old. Regardless of whose wedding it might resemble, it's a splendid one, and my daughter's excited to be attending her first royal wedding. Lady Elenda spoke smoothly for her daughter. Over at the head table, Ariel saw a smiling Princess Rhaenyra lean into her uncle's side whilst Daemon interlinked their hands, the two acting more like newlyweds than the actual newlyweds did. The parents were seated on each side of the bride and groom, so Ariel's eyes trailed from Daemon to his daughter on his immediate left. Bella was using her knife to move around a piece of butter-crusted orach on her plate, whilst Aegon accepted a goblet of wine from the help. As he did, Aegon's elbow grazed along Bella's, and the accidental contact made them look over. They exchanged polite smiles before returning to their individual activities. Had they talked at all? Even after swearing love and a lifetime-long dedication before their gods, they still acted like two strangers partnered for a class project. It's the first of several royal weddings to come, Lady Elenda said, bringing Ariel back to her conversation. Have you and Prince Aemon discussed your wedding yet? No, Ariel said, aiming her wand at her honey-coated duck to strip the meat off the bones with a slightly tweaked household spell. The book, Where There's a Wand, There's a Way, stated the charm was for separating items while packing, like untangling socks from underwear. But potato. It was about the same usage, wasn't it? Speaking of potatoes, where had the ball of potatoes drifted off to? Leaning forwards, Ariel spotted the barrel a ways down the table by Lord Bortimus Celtigar, while ignoring the awkwardness caused by her casual use of magic. What about your wedding to Prince Daeron? She asked. When will that be? It's a ways off yet, Lady Elaine said, her blue eyes huge while watching Ariel do something as mundane as failing to get someone to pass the potatoes. Hagrid was attempting to explain what a festal was to Lord Boris. Imagine a starved black Destier, so thin the ribs and bones shows, but with huge bat wings on their backs and sunken milky eyes like it's blind. Looks off-putting to many the first time they see one. Of course, people must have seen death before they can see Festals. They're invisible to the naked eye before that. But they're dead smart and understand human speech just fine. At least English. It seemed rude to interrupt, and Lord Celtigar was turned away in conversation with the Master of Coin, Lord Beesbury. Across the table, Lady Elaine continued detailing her engagement to Daeron. My betrothed is busy fostering in Old Town, and he tends to earn his knighthood before we marry. Mother says I'll likely be of age before I'll get to be a bride. I'm glad to hear that, Ariel nodded. That seems a reasonable arrangement for you both. Prince Daeron is very thoughtful, Lady Elaine gushed, becoming bubbly and animated again when there wasn't any new display of magic. So gallant, smart, and he's handsome too. I want our wedding to be like this one. I heard you assisted with Lady Bella's wedding gown. Is that true? I want one as brilliant when I marry my prince. Maybe Elaine was 7? Or maybe Ariel had become too jaded, and Lady Elaine's bright-eyed naivete for her fairy tale future made it comparatively obvious. The kid had been at the Red Keep for a few months, and most of it was spent sheltered in lessons with her septa and sisters, selectively told spoon-fed versions of events by her parents or pre-approved sources. Her father wasn't making it easier for his daughters to prepare when he wouldn't allow them to learn how to read either. Ariel wasn't sure if she was green with envy or pitied the girl. Maybe it was both. Would Elaine get her happily ever after? If anyone, she sounded akin to Bella a few years ago. Since no one was volunteering to pass the damn potatoes, Hale grabbed her wand and with a swish and flick fixed the issue.
The flying bowel made Lord Beesbury freeze, and Lord Celticar jolt so sharply he overturned his goblet of Arbor Gold. Boris Baratheon's mouth fell open in stunned silence, and they all followed the path of the flying potatoes soaring over to Hariel. "My apologies, my lords," she excused, serving herself from the bowel. "But no one would pass the potatoes." Hariel felt uncomfortable, but disconnected from the emotion simultaneously. What did it matter? She tried to keep a lid on her magic at the Red Keep, only using it for presenting herself a certain way, but it didn't seem to have helped. At her best behavior, people had still seen fit to judge her a shrew for it.
Sorry, Hariel, I didn't notice," Haggett said.
"I sorted it out." She waved him off as the bride and groom stood up at the head table, drawing the attention of the hall. The dancing portion of the event which Lady Aline had anticipated was about to begin. Aegon and Bela headed out to the cleared space while musicians began playing a pretty tune to accommodate their first dance. Well practiced in courtly arts, Bela and Aegon were both good dancers. With the eyes of the hall trailed on them, the couple glided around each other in a rhythmic routine, while Hariel watched from the corner of her eye. Their dance ended with a round of applause, and then the guests were encouraged to join in. Hariel spotted Luke pull a somewhat reluctant Rhaena out of her chair, while across the hall Corlys escorted Rhaenys into the row of dancers. Even Jace was headed towards Helena with stubborn determination. Prince Daeron had risen over at the head table too. He had been seated along the left short end, and only had to walk off the dais and a few steps to reach an eagerly waiting Lady Aline. "Would you care to dance, my lady?" Daeron asked his betrothed, offering his arm. Aline leapt out of her seat, nearly tripping over the hem of her gown in her haste. Lady Elenda Baratheon looked after her daughter with a fondly exasperated smile, before she and her husband got up and followed her example. "Do you want to try it? It's less complicated than it looks," Hariel asked Hagrid. Hagrid chortled. "Nah, don't know the steps, but you go ahead and have fun." Hariel considered it, but when she saw Aemond finish his goblet in one swing and push back his chair, she found herself standing up automatically, meeting his eyes for the first time since entering the throne room. She didn't know what he'd intended, and the uncertainty bothered her. Aemond could dance, but it wasn't something he favored. This was his brother's wedding though, and arguments aside, they'd been betrothed that day. After her own betrothal, Bella had spent the night crying her eyes out, but come morning she stuck her head in a bucket of snow-cold water, dressed her best, put on a smile, and stood tall with Aegon during the announcements, because the alternative was, well, Hariel knew it wouldn't be good for her. Aemond could stay angry at her for laughing. Merlin knew Hariel hadn't moved past his ardently delightful experiences yet, but he better dunk his head in that bucket soon. Some were bound to have noticed Aemond's reluctance to approach her, and if he took it further, like if he asked another lady to dance instead, Aemond might as well slap Hariel in front of the entire court and it'd still be less damaging to her reputation. Aemond walked off the dais with a swagger that reminded her unfortunately of Daemon, but at least he headed directly for their table. Lady Hariel. He was behaving like nothing was amiss, but for all the gallantry there wasn't much warmth either. Though as Hariel slipped her arm through his elbow, a little bit of relief pierced through her irritation. As frustrated as she felt, Hariel hadn't wanted him to dismiss her. "I worried you wouldn't offer." "You're my betrothed," Aemond said, his polite mask going a little stiff around the edges. Still. Aemond wasn't impressed by the quip, which, yeah, it had been a cheap shot. It's not as if an argument could break betrothals. Though it had only been agreed upon that morning, already it would probably require both the king and Faith to break the engagement, seeing as Westerosi betrothals were as binding as English marriages, if not more. There were ways someone could cheat the system, and it happened on rare occasions, but either they had to disappear to some place they'd never be found, or they escaped their intended marriage by marrying another person instead, and they'd never hear the end of it. For whatever reason they broke their betrothal, be it good or bad or even necessary, they'd have broken an oath. A betrothal was a sacred promise, and in Westeros, where a person was only as good as their reputation, as worthy of trust as the perceived validity of their words, oath breakers were rarely allowed to forget their sin, especially not by the slighted party. Since they were about to join the crowd, Ariel stalled to do some adjustments to her gown. "What's that for?" Eamon eyed her wand. "More flying potatoes." Ariel gestured to the charmed flower embroidery across her flaring green gown. "To stop the spells." It was enough of a distraction some of Eamon's cold ire gave way for confusion. "How come?" "After you, I'll have other dance partners," Ariel pointed out. Even now, people were unsure if the animated blooms across Ariel's gowns were real or not, and they worried direct contact with the charmed lilies might give them magical pollen allergies. Normally, this aversion to direct contact wasn't an issue since it was strangers who reacted that way, but this time Ariel was the one forcing her proximity by joining the dancers, the majority of whom were strangers. Eamon wasn't convinced though. "Leave it be. They don't know how to react to it." "So?" he dared her. "That sounds like their own issue, not yours." That was easy for him to say. Eamon wasn't the one dealing with their suspicious judgment of her magic usage and awkward silences. "Do you know what the Dragon Keepers say?" Eamon challenged breezily. "If a man fears fire, there's no one to blame but himself if he visits the Dragon Pit." Ariel held back a snort. If a man met fire in the Dragon Pit, placing blame would be the least of his immediate concerns. "Fine." Ariel twirled her wand. "But you'll have to join me." Eamon didn't catch on. "How?" Instead of explaining, she demonstrated. Eamon wore a black, side-draped cavalier shoulder cape with a bright Targaryen sigil embroidery. The dark velvet hung past his hip from a leather shoulder guard, and with well-practiced charm work, Ariel made the red dragon stitched into it come to life. The three heads began moving back and forth, before it set off slithering around the canvas of the fabric. With her work done, Ariel pocketed her wand. "Shall we?" Though everyone started with a partner, it was more of a group dance. All it required was the ability to follow the steps, which in deference to different maturity and ages weren't too complicated. Ariel had learned these dances alongside Rhaenyra's sons years ago, which meant she was more familiar going through the routines with a partner a head shorter than herself. The participants had already gathered along 2 rows, men to one side and the females on the other. Eamon led to the middle, where people made room for the prince to have a spot with Ariel opposite him. A lord Ariel didn't know stood next to him with a lady she assumed was his daughter. It might have been a young wife too, but their strong similarities indicated a close blood relation. "Prince Aemond, your cape, how very striking. Is this the magics of your lady here?" the unknown man asked, watching the path of the coiling red dragon clamber around Aemon's shoulder guard to the fabric flaring down his back. The lord startled when the dragon let out a burst of embroidery-patterned fire. The man's reaction to magic wasn't off-putting for Aemond though. If anything, he stood confident and tall, with a gleeful aura akin to someone who'd just been introduced to chocolate frogs. "It is. My betrothed can do much, bringing forth dragons from smoke and fire and fabric alike." "Surely the dragon won't come out of the cloak?" the man asked. "It'll remain contained?" Sometimes Ariel wondered what muggles thought of her spell work, and this remark was telling. Did he think Ariel had stuffed a small thread-made dragon inside Aemon's cloak, like a spider lurking within a wall? Before she could explain herself, Aemon's chin jutted out, looking down his nose at the man like he was dragon dung. "Are you insinuating Lady Ariel or myself would cause a scandal at my brother's wedding, my lord?" The lord backtracked immediately, unwilling to doubt Aemon's judgment the way he had Ariel's. No, of course not, my prince." "Then why ask such a question?" "I beg your pardon, I meant no disrespect to you or your lady, Ariel." Ariel softened the dismissal with a clarification. "The dragon sigil will remain within the cloak, my lord." The start of the dance began when a merry tune echoed through the hall. The men's row moved first with a blind bow, the girls curtsied, before Ariel took 2 steps to the right while Aemond mirrored her on the other row. Surely Aemond hadn't forgotten they were arguing mere minutes ago, but the charm work had broken the stifling tension anyway. She was pretty sure it wasn't the dancing making Eamon smirk. More likely it was from picturing the magical chaos he had just insisted on was undignified for a prince. It seemed the thought of having dragons bursting out of his cloak to wreak havoc perked Eamon up. Though admittedly she understood why, because that would have been a wicked thing to happen. Maybe I'll try it, Ariel told him as the dance required him to do a step and slide away from each other. To release the dragon? Eamon asked, glancing down to his cloak. And leave me bereft of my house sigil? How will he even recognize me without Ariel? Ariel bit her lip, knowing she was pushing her luck. This easy back and forth between them was likely nothing but a temporary reprieve. You could manage without. What true dragon requires a label to know what they are? Eamon's eyes narrowed. I had no sigil when we met, leaving with no option but to pass judgment without. My dear, you don't want to know what tales I heard before we met. Eamon smirked. Was it not some unfounded accusation about my parentage? How unoriginal, she said. Though the fallacy didn't look to persist past meeting me. How could I not see it differently after Vega's fire? The suggestive lilt had Ariel's cheeks heating. He likely didn't mean that how he suggested it. Is that when you... She swallowed down the rest of the sentence. Had he liked her that long? Surely not, but maybe that's how long Eamon had expected to marry her. And as he'd reminded her just hours ago, duty and love weren't the same. Ariel had an urge to yank at her hair in frustration, or maybe pull on his. How could Eamon have proposed and yet left her wobbling in mixed signals? How could he be so bold to claim, I'd be a good husband to you, and still leave her unsure what he wanted from marriage? Because even as all his efforts to make this work repeated in her mind, she was also looking up into his purple eyes, her gaze trailing the freckles dusted over his nose and a slight smile on his sharp mouth, and wondered, who the hell had examined Eamon from up close too? What did it even mean that he was experienced? Experienced in what precisely? Kissing? More than kissing? With whom? Paid company? A girlfriend? And which scenario unnerved her more? Whatever it was that had occurred during their courtship? Initially, her anger originated from the shock of having misjudged Eamon, to be so wrong about him. During the months of courting, he'd been so engaged and attentive. But even long before that, Eamon had never struck Ariel as a cheater. So his spiteful admission of being with other girls had hit her with the impact of a bludger to the back of the head. She hadn't seen it coming. Yet even now, with a headache forming and feeling embarrassed at how easily he'd fooled her, she kept doubting. Would you at least tell me whether they are here? Ariel asked, her voice lowering and switching to Valyrian for good measure. As Eamon was not a mind reader, he didn't understand who she meant. If who's here? Your experiences. She'd seen Lady Jacqueline Redwine before, and maybe this was why she'd always disliked Ariel. As rumors of our betrothal are making the rounds, should I be on guard against a scorned lady plotting to throw a drink in my face? Startled, Eamon missed a step. No, they'd never be here. No. Eamon didn't blush, but he'd gone rigidly uncomfortable, similarly to the time in Winterfell where he'd summoned Ariel to discuss how her behavior with Cregan was causing gossip. But the throne room was hardly the place to discuss infidelity, and their dance had come to an end. Eamon's new partner was Lady Beesbury, while Ariel now stood opposite the unknown lord who'd questioned her magic. Eamon glanced back to Ariel like he wanted to say more, but the music kept playing. The next round started, and the conversation was left hanging at that awkward point. The lord was a good dancer, and he was on his best behavior too. There wasn't any talk though, leaving Ariel's mind split between following the steps and derailing back to Eamon. Perchance Eamon lied? People said stupid things when they were angry sometimes, but when Eamon got pissed off, his weapon of choice was usually hurtful truths. That left her with another option, one quite likely to be true as well. One that meant he told the truth, but twisted it in a stupidly exaggerated way because he was angry. That it had been before. That his experience whatever that had been, happened before the North and before making his feelings known to her. Ariel wanted that to be the case, because she wouldn't hold such against him. But if it was not, if it was recent, well, Ariel would have to make it clear any cheating would stop if he valued his health. That she'd react to him keeping lovers on the side about as kindly as a dragon would take their human trying to bond with another dragon. There were some misguided rumors that Targaryen polygamy practices had something to do with their dragons, but those were myths. A misconception caused by those who assumed the incest and polygamy traditions were related. Those were two different traditions that happened to overlap a time or two. More likely their polygamy were human traditions originating from Essos. But even today some cultures, such as the Dothraki, allowed a cult to take multiple wives. Or in Westeros too, where the Ironborn men could take a rock wife for their main spouse, alongside multiple salt wives on the side, and any children of the salt wives were not bastards. Though regardless of where the Targaryens' version of polygamy practices originated, it certainly had nothing to do with stimulating the mindset and customs of actual dragons. Seeing as true dragons, the fire-breathing ones, were notoriously monogamous. A dragon accepted only a single rider at a time, and they were even more selective when it came to relationships with dragon companionship, where, as in the case of Vermivore and Silverwing, they'd stick to only one partner throughout their lives. The crowd of dancers followed the steps in tandem with the skillful music of the minstrels. Though Ariel faked ignorance whenever a new magic-weary partner didn't know how to move around her flaring skirt, she was getting more comfortable with his steps. She danced with Vaemon Velaryon, followed by his son Ser Daeron, then Ormond Hightower, Clement Celtigar, Tyler Lannister, before ending up with Luke. Will my attire become magical from dancing with you, like Aemon's? He asked without being either scared or intrigued, just curious. Will the Velaryon sigil start swimming all over my coat too? Ariel laughed, shaking her head. Don't you know I have more control than that? You've made mistakes before. Luke snickered under his breath. Remember what you did to your door back home? I put that back together. It's as good as new. And the hinges no longer squeak, do they? You melted it first though, Luke said gleefully, not missing a beat as they were supposed to do a step and slide away from each other, followed by a twirl. Ariel rolled her eyes. Fine, yes, and don't look so smug. That might have been an Urin spell work, but this wasn't. After her turn with Luke, Ariel found herself opposite the groom himself. Prince Aegon? Were you discussing a melting door with my nephew? It didn't technically melt. It's called a transfiguration. A spell where instead of oiling the hinges, she turned the entire door into an oil-like substance, which is why so many knew of that blunder. The mess had been beyond belief and impossible to cover up in time. I am unfamiliar with the term. All I know is you wave your stick and magic happens, making fires or sending potatoes flying. Aegon says, and then added quietly, or whipping around my brother, before he returned to a conversational volume. But you require the stick for everything, do you not? I do prefer it as an aiming tool, akin to how a bow makes it easier to aim an arrow, but my magic is in my blood, Ariel said vaguely. There were alternative substances to channel magic through, such as the unicorn tail hair Hagrid had picked off branches and bushes during his groundskeeper days, and those were used as wand cores. They came loose from unicorns when they traveled through the Forbidden Forest, and Hagrid collected them to bandage wounded creatures. So Hagrid had a whole cluster of them in his hut that had come along to Westeros with them. The results of channeling magic through them were unpredictable at best though. Your wife can tell you about it as well. Ariel pushed down an instinctive bile at addressing Bela as your wife. It didn't fit. She's been around my magic longer than anyone. Though speaking of your lovely bride, congratulations once again, my prince. You've been so fortunate. Though only a child of 2 and 10, Bela's already so beautiful and vivacious. She is. The way Aegon's brows climbed made it clear Ariel had been subtle when she stressed the C word. He let out a soft laugh, finding something amusing.
I heard of your stipulations for Aemond. I know what your opinions on my bride's age is. Do you approve of it? Hale asked, honestly curious. What does it matter? She's my lady wife. That didn't clarify anything, yet it was more than she'd expected. For someone so expressive and unabashed, Hale didn't know Aegon at all. Bella is dear to me. She's dear to quite a few here, actually. Hale told him point blank. She's pretty, but she burns with a Targaryen fire, and none of us wants to see it quenched. She smiled sharply. Least of all you. That almost sounds like a threat. Yet Aegon sounded bored. Why would you think that? You're her protector now, and surely capable of the duty, she said dryly. Princes treat their beloved wives justly, don't they? Befitting of their age and station. With a roll of his eyes, Aegon sighed, looking done with everything. After Aegon, Harry danced with a couple more before people broke off to give way for the entertainment. The middle aisle was cleared for a group of performers doing acrobatic juggling, knife throwing, fire blowing, using ropes for daring stunts. A crowd remained watching by the edge of the cleared space, while others returned to their seats as well. Ariel opted to remain on her feet when she saw that Hagrid had left their table. Twice as tall as an X-Man, it only took a couple of glances around the throne room to see Hagrid had left. Maybe to use the bathroom or for some air. But she wasn't in the mood to chit-chat with the Baratheons either, and instead walked around the hall. Ariel greeted people as she passed, waiters with refreshments or other lords and ladies alike. The sickly king had remained in his seat, and Sir Otto occupied his daughter's seat in her absence to keep Viserys company at the deserted head table. Prince Daemon was down in the hall, leaning against one of the fat stone columns, chatting with Sir Tyland Lannister. The prince smiled widely when Sir Tyland held up his goblet, and Daemon knocked his drink against his with enough carelessness some of the contents of the cup spilled into the others. Ariel glimpsed Princess Rhaenyra heading around the hall, but without warning changed direction, perhaps to avoid walking by Lord Corlys. Jace watched the acrobats with a goblet in hand with Helena. He emptied his drink in one go, shuddered slightly, and then smiled at something Helena said. Harry looked idly after Aemond, but was unable to see him before reaching the back of the hall, where Bela stood with Queen Alicent. It's a big transition. I recall how nervous I was during my wedding to the king, Queen Alicent said, and Harry slowed down, eavesdropping under the disguise of watching the performers. It would have been a comfort to have my mother there to share her wisdom. However, like yourself, my mother passed before I married. Bela fidgeted. As far as Harry could guess, even if Bela felt similarly, talking about her dead mother with her queenly mother-in-law rubbed her the wrong way. It's momentous to be a bride, but it's for naught but a day, and from tomorrow you'll be Aegon's wife. That comes with different duties than any you've experienced of yet. Alicent smiled warmly at Bela. You're expected to take a while before you've settled into your new duties, though it's important you give it your all. In many ways, you're fortunate to have this time dedicated to Aegon alone. Then soon enough you'll be a mother, and then your duties will be split between your children and Aegon. My grandmother and Princess Rhaenyra have prepared me well for marriage, Your Grace. I'll be a true and good wife to Prince Aegon. There'll be new people and I'll have to familiarize myself with my husband's duties, but I'm quite looking forward to living in the capital. Bela sounded just like when she was reciting poems to Septa Mega. You've taken well to the capital, but surely I expect there's some nervousness to leave Dragonstone. Moving away from home can be upsetting for many new brides too. I was born in Pentos, Your Grace, Bela said, getting a little sarcastic there. Surely moving across a bay is less dramatic than relocating between continents. Alicent chuckled softly. I assumed you'd miss your sister, though at least with this move you won't have to switch languages, and you'll be with your father's side of the family, whom you'll get to know better. Right. Bela's smile was still in place when she cut their conversation off with a curt, "Excuse me, Your Grace." Concerned by the sudden dismissal, Harry went after her. There were a scattering of people in the grand staircases too, but Bela avoided interacting with anyone by quickly ducking into a side passage. Bela? Harry called after her.
I don't require an escort, Heriel. I'm getting some fresh air. Bela called back quickly. It was getting rather stifling in there. That was debatable. All the fireplaces in the throne room had been blazing throughout the day to heat the enormous space, but the persistent winter, drafts and poor isolation made it impossible to keep it as comfortably warm as the smaller chambers. Bela had stopped by a window facing the courtyard, keeping her back to Heriel and face away. It was probably the performers. The fire acrobatics are very impressive, but it made the hall warmer. Exactly. Bela sounded strangled, as if she was fighting tears. Heriel felt helpless. Bela? I don't want to live it. Bela cut off as people entered the passage behind Heriel. As much as Heriel wanted to help, it wouldn't happen if Bela had to suffer an audience. Lord Hayford, Heriel said, placing herself in the middle of the hallway to prevent anyone passing. What are you doing here? The entertainment started and you're missing it. We're aware, but I thought I saw the bride leave this way. Isn't that her there, Lady Bela? It is. Lady Bela stepped away from the feast to freshen up, Heriel said meaningfully. A polite phrase whenever a lady needed to use a lavatory. Lord Hayford nodded in understanding, and with a slightly inebriated smile left with his companion. Once they were ushered out of the hallway, Heriel approached Bela alone. If you remain here, I think others than myself and Lord Hayford might approach you too. Why don't we walk for a bit? Bela dried her eyes, and after considering it, she pushed away from the window and fell in step with Heriel. There was no destination in mind, and their pace was unrushed while the music and chatter from the throne room grew distant. Taking a stroll through the courtyard wasn't an option without a coat, so they stuck to the hallways. There were a few passing guards and servants, but the occupants of this part of the keep were attending the wedding feast. You know, I've lived at several castles and in many places, but I've never lived somewhere Reyna didn't, Bela said. Last night was the last time we shared a room. I doubt Reyna would mind sleepovers, Heriel said. Whenever you want them. It won't be the same. Perhaps, Heriel agreed, as lying wouldn't help here either. You're married now. Sorry. Hell, I can't believe you're married. It's hard to wrap my head around. Heriel had to wrangle away the wave of discomfort the words caused her. This wasn't about her. Of course, being married is a big change for you, but this is a significant change for Reyna as well. I know she'll feel your daily absence as much as you will feel hers. You'll both have to adjust. Something about that stirred Bela. Her purple eyes were fixed ahead, and she kept smoothing down invisible creases on her gown. At last, whatever was on her mind spilled out. She bled. It took Heriel a moment to put it together, and then her heart nearly stopped from the shock. Moon's blood? You mean Reyna, right? Not you. Bela nodded. Aye, it's Reyna. When? Heriel asked, baffled she hadn't been made aware. People were not shy about this topic. A girl's first period was announced at family dinners like one might announce a pregnancy. It was weird, but for better or worse, they didn't make the same stigma against talking of menstruation as Heriel had grown up with. She got her moon's blood the night before we left for the Red Keep, Bela whispered under her breath. We stripped our bed ourselves and hid the sheet at home, but it was impossible here. Grandmother knows. A little while after you left this morning, Grandmother stopped by our chambers and saw the sheets. You shared a bed? Heriel was so alarmed, Bela hushed her to remind her to keep her voice down. Princess Renice knows it's Reyna, doesn't she? Because if Princess Renice saw the bloodstains on the sheets, had they made it clear which twin it came from? She knows, but a maid came in with Grandmother, and she must have told the Queen. The way she spoke, I suspect she's aware Reyna has flowered. And we're twins. I might get my moon's blood any day. But unlike Reyna, I'm married now. So that means... Aegon, But I don't want... I'll handle it, Ariel said fiercely. Pardon? Bella watched her strangely. How? Ariel had no clue. Even if you start bleeding as we speak, there's no way in hell I'd let there be a bedding. Married or not, you're 2 and 10. Bella smiled sadly. That's not up to you. The hell it isn't, Ariel hissed. I don't care what I have to do. I'll lock you safe in your chamber and put a fence of fire before your door. So I'm to live behind a fiery barricade for the rest of my life? Bella asked wryly. In that case, wouldn't it be easier if I flew away on Moondancer instead? I could roam as I pleased, and it'd free up your time from being stuck as my guard dog. The wistful way Bella spoke gave Ariel pause. Is that something you've considered? Running away? No. Bella lied. Ariel just knew she did. It was unnecessary though, as Ariel understood the temptation all too well. It's just... I was born in Pentos, and of late I've dreamed of seeing the hot sun sinking on the horizon across the Pentoshi port. Bella said longingly. Feel the soothing breeze rustling the palm trees, taste the spicy food, listen to the beautiful Pentoshi music. Those things were my norm once, but it's been years now. I miss the brightly colored flowers, exploring the sandy hills and picking sweetly ripe fruits straight from the trees. Listening to Bella daydream of her childhood, it struck Ariel that maybe Pentos represented the same to Bella as Hogwarts did to her. Though for Bella the place she associated with safety, happiness, and a wholesome family life was only across the ocean, a dragon ride away. Bella likely didn't understand how hard it'd be to survive on her own, that even if she returned to Pentos, it wouldn't be exactly like her childhood dreams. But that didn't take away the strength of the fantasy, nor the yearning. It was also a testimony to how important her family was that she hadn't attempted it. I get it, Ariel smiled. Of late I've dreamed of a simpler time too. Of Pentos? No, of Hogwarts. Their walk had at least calmed Bella and dried her tears. Had it been any other day, Ariel would have suggested that since Bella was worn out, she should retire to her chambers. It was nearing her bedtime after all. Though the bride's absence would be noticed, and instead they started to stroll back in a thoughtful lull, both stuck in childhood fantasies of an easier time and place. They walked in companionable silence until... On your son's memory. That's what I'm doing, princess. They were in a passage not far from the throne room when Ariel and Bella stopped, both having heard a sharp Valyrian simultaneously. The speakers weren't being loud, but just audible enough to be overheard around the corner. When people switched to speaking another language, their pitch sounded different and their tempo changed, so it took Ariel a few seconds to recognize the voices as those of Lord Corlys and Princess Rhaenyra. You may pick which of your sons to be your heir, princess. Prince Jacaerys will make a great king someday, but it's my right as lord to pick whom I deem best as my heir, Lord Corlys replied tersely. Surely Bella had recognized the speakers too, but she remained rooted to the spot, eavesdropping as much as Ariel was. Laenor was your heir, and this is not what he wanted, Lord Corlys. He loved all our boys deeply, and Lucerys is not your only son. Corlys cut the princess off. What of Rhaena? What of your daughter Laena's memory? Rhaenyra argued. Their voices were drifting away, heading back in the direction of the throne room and disrupted by the soft echoes of their footsteps. Ariel edged towards the corner, treading carefully and grimacing whenever her gown rustled. Laenor was in favor of Luke and Rhaena's betrothal. He pushed for it at the small council, as anyone can tell you. His wishes were to secure his own line as well as his sister's. But if you do this, if you skip over him, your granddaughter will never be the Lady of Driftmark. I'm aware. It won't be Driftmark, but Prince Lucerys is... Ariel didn't catch the rest of Lord Corlys' statement because they left out of hearing range. Next to her, Bella's expression was oddly blank. The only sign something was amiss was how tightly her hands were fisted. So tight her knuckles paled.